Tonight, you will hear the story of a king who feared silence, a turtle who could not stop speaking, and the ancient lesson that changed them both forever. Long ago, beneath the moonlit skies of ancient India, a creature fell from the heavens because of a single careless word. But this is not truly a story about a turtle. It is a story about the restless human mind, the endless noise inside us, and the peace that appears only when we finally become still. So dim the lights, slow your breathing, and let the world grow quiet around you tonight. The night in Jataka monastery was impossibly still. Not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness that comes only after the world has exhausted itself. The oil lamps burned low beneath the ancient sala trees. Their golden flames trembled softly in the warm darkness, as if even fire itself had grown tired of movement. Beyond the monastery walls, the forests of Kosala whispered beneath a slow night wind. Somewhere far away, an owl called once, and then surrendered again to silence. The monks sat gathered beneath the shadow of the Blessed One. No one spoke. Some had spent the entire day wandering for alms beneath the scorching sun. Others had meditated until their knees ached and their thoughts dissolved into drifting clouds. Yet now, in the deep blue hush of evening, every breath seemed to slow before the Buddha-like waves settling upon a dark shore. The Blessed One opened his eyes, and even the insects seemed to quiet themselves. His gaze moved gently across the assembly of bhikkhus. Calm, unhurried, vast as moonlight upon black water. Earlier that day, there had been disputes among several monks. Nothing violent, nothing cruel. Only words, too many words. One monk had interrupted another during recitation. Another had defended himself too sharply. Voices had risen. Pride had entered the room unnoticed, disguising itself as righteousness. And as always, suffering followed quietly behind it. The Buddha looked upon them not with disappointment, but with immeasurable compassion. Because he understood something few beings understood, most suffering enters the world through the mouth. Not swords, not famine, not storms. Words. Words spoken too quickly. Words spoken to defend the self. Words spoken because silence feels unbearable. At last, the Blessed One spoke. His voice was low and deep, like distant thunder rolling across mountains long before rain arrives. Bhikkhus. The monks bowed their heads. In ages long past, before this present life, there was once a king in the city of Benares who delighted excessively in speech. He spoke without measure, without restraint, without wisdom. The night wind moved softly through the trees. And because of this, the Buddha continued, great suffering followed him like a shadow. The younger monks listened carefully. Many among them had once been princes, merchants, scholars, or warriors before abandoning worldly life. Yet even after shaving their heads and wearing saffron robes, the old fires of pride still lingered within the human heart. The Buddha understood this. He always understood. That king, he said softly, could not endure silence. The words settled heavily into the darkness. Some monks lowered their eyes. Others quietly reflected upon their own restless minds, upon the strange fear that arises when speech disappears and one is left alone with thought itself. The Blessed One continued, "In that distant age, I was born as the son of a wise minister in the court of that king. A faint breeze stirred the lamps. I wished to teach the king the danger of careless speech. Yet kings rarely accept correction directly. Therefore, I waited patiently for the right moment." The Buddha paused. And in the silence that followed, the monastery seemed to disappear. The monks could almost hear another world awakening. A world of ancient kingdoms, moonlit palaces, snow mountains beyond mortal roads, and a turtle whose tongue would lead him toward death. Far to the north, beyond the dusty roads of Benares, beyond forests where elephants wandered beneath banyan shadows, beyond villages wrapped in smoke and dusk, there rose the great Himalayan ranges. Ancient, silent, endless. Their snowy peaks pierced the heavens like white flames frozen in time. Golden dawns touched their summits before reaching the lands below. Rivers born from melted glaciers flowed like silver veins through valleys untouched by kings or war. Hidden among those mountains lay a sacred lake. The waters were so still they reflected the stars with perfect clarity. Wild blue lotuses floated upon its dark surface. During the night, moonlight turned the lake into polished obsidian. And within that quiet lake lived a turtle. He was not wicked, not cruel, not greedy, but he possessed a dangerous weakness. He loved speaking. He spoke in the morning. He spoke at noon. He spoke beneath rainstorms and beneath moonlight. He spoke when others wished to rest. He spoke when silence would have been wiser. And most dangerous of all, he believed every thought deserved to become sound. The fish knew him well. The cranes avoided him. Even the wind seemed unable to escape his endless opinions. Yet despite this flaw, the turtle possessed a sincere heart. He admired beauty. He loved companionship. And deep within himself, he feared loneliness more than anything else. Perhaps that is why he talked so much. Because silence forced him to hear himself. One autumn evening, as amber clouds drifted slowly across the sky, 2 wild geese descended upon the lake. Their feathers glowed pale gold beneath the setting sun. They were travelers of the high mountains, beings accustomed to vast skies and frozen winds. Every season they journeyed between hidden valleys unknown to ordinary creatures. The turtle watched them with fascination. The geese carried a stillness he had never known. Even when they said nothing, peace surrounded them. The turtle swam eagerly toward them. "Welcome," he exclaimed before they had fully landed. "Travelers, you must be exhausted. Where have you come from? How far have you flown? Are there truly golden caves in the northern cliffs as the cranes claim? Have you seen the snow lions? Is it true the stars appear larger beyond the peaks?" The 2 geese exchanged a glance. Then, softly, they smiled. Because unlike many others, they were patient beings. And thus began an unlikely friendship. Night after night, the turtle listened to the stories of the mountains. The geese described hidden caverns filled with crystals that glowed beneath moonlight. They spoke of silent forests where no human foot had ever walked. They described valleys where ancient sages meditated beside waterfalls for decades without speaking a single word. The turtle was mesmerized. His entire life had been confined to the boundaries of one lake. But now, through these travelers, the universe suddenly felt endless. One evening, as winter winds began descending from the mountains, one of the geese spoke gently, "Friend turtle, soon we must return north." The turtle's heart tightened unexpectedly. So soon? The cold season approaches. The turtle lowered his gaze toward the dark water. For the first time in many years, he did not know what to say. The second goose observed him quietly. Then she asked, "Would you like to come with us?" The turtle's eyes widened. "To the mountains?" The geese nodded. "There is a golden cave beside a hidden lake in the Himalayas. Peaceful, silent, untouched by hunters or kings. We believe you would find happiness there." The turtle's heart surged with longing. To leave the lake, to see the world, to escape the smallness of everything he had ever known. "Yes," he cried instantly. "Yes, I will come." But almost immediately, his excitement collapsed. His face darkened. "But I cannot fly." The mountains became quiet around them. The geese looked thoughtfully toward the evening sky. Then at last, one of them spoke. "There may be a way." The turtle leaned forward eagerly. The goose found a long, sturdy branch lying near the lake. "If you bite this branch firmly in the center," she explained, "we will each carry one end in our beaks and fly together." The turtle's eyes filled with wonder. "But there is one condition." The wind moved softly across the black water. "You must remain completely silent during the journey." The turtle blinked. "Silent? "If you open your mouth even once," said the goose gently, "you will fall." The turtle laughed loudly. "Is that all? My friends, you underestimate me. Of course I can remain silent." But the geese said nothing. Because wise beings understand, those who speak most confidently about self-control often possess the least of it. The stars slowly emerged above the lake. And somewhere deep within the darkness, destiny quietly began unfolding. Before dawn arrived, the mountains were blue with cold. Mist drifted low across the hidden lake like wandering spirits reluctant to leave the earth. Frost gathered silently along the reeds at the water's edge. The stars still burned above the Himalayas, pale and distant, while the world waited in that fragile moment between night and morning. The turtle had not slept. All through the night, his thoughts had circled endlessly like trapped birds. The mountains, the golden cave, the skies beyond the clouds, a life greater than the small black lake he had always known. And beneath all those thoughts, hidden quietly like a snake beneath leaves, there coiled another feeling. Fear. Not fear of falling. Not fear of death. But fear of silence. For the first time in his life, the turtle began to understand something unsettling. Speech had always protected him. As long as he spoke, he never needed to listen too carefully to the noise within himself. Memories. Regrets. Loneliness. The strange emptiness that appears when the world grows quiet. Most creatures fear darkness. But many fear silence even more. At last, the eastern horizon softened into silver. The geese stood beside the lake preparing for departure. Their movements were calm, precise, without wasted energy. Creatures of the sky understood the value of stillness. In high winds and thin air, panic meant death. The turtle watched them anxiously. One goose placed the branch carefully upon the ground. "Friend," she said gently, "before we leave, you must understand the danger clearly." The turtle nodded impatiently. "Yes, yes, I understand." But the goose continued. "No matter what happens below us, no matter who speaks, no matter what you hear, you must remain silent." The turtle forced a laugh. "You repeat yourself as though I were a child." The second goose looked at him quietly. "Words become habits," he replied softly. "And habits become chains." The turtle did not answer. Because somewhere deep inside himself, he knew the goose was right. Still, pride rose quickly within him. He had spoken all his life. Surely remaining silent for a single journey could not be difficult. Surely he possessed at least that much control over himself. The morning wind strengthened. Clouds drifted slowly across the snowy peaks. The geese lifted the branch. Ready? The turtle inhaled deeply. Then he bit down firmly upon the center of the wood. "Remember," said the goose, her voice now serious. "No matter what happens, do not open your mouth." The turtle rolled his eyes slightly. Then the two geese spread their enormous wings. With a sudden burst of movement, they rose into the sky. The lake fell away beneath them. Cold wind rushed across the turtle's face. His eyes widened in astonishment. The world was far larger than he had imagined. The mountains unfolded endlessly beneath the dawn. Rivers glittered like silver threads through deep valleys. Pine forests spread across the earth in dark green waves. Waterfalls poured from cliffs like streams of white silk. The turtle had spent his entire life staring outward from the surface of a lake. Now he was inside the sky itself. Joy surged through him. He wanted to shout, to laugh, to ask 1,000 questions. But he remembered the branch clenched between his jaws. And so, for perhaps the first time in his existence, the turtle remained silent. The geese flew steadily north to south, descending gradually toward the warmer plain surrounding Benares. Hours passed. The sun rose higher. Villages appeared below them, tiny clusters of clay houses beside winding roads. Farmers worked the fields with oxen beneath the growing heat. Children chased each other through dust and sunlight. The turtle watched everything with hungry fascination. Never before had he understood how vast human life truly was. And never before had he felt so small. Yet strangely, the silence was beginning to change him. At first, it had felt unbearable. His thoughts crashed wildly against the walls of his mind, demanding release through speech. But as the hours passed, another sensation slowly emerged beneath the noise. Stillness. The kind the geese carried naturally. The kind sages sought in forests and caves. The turtle began noticing things he had never noticed before. The rhythm of wings cutting through wind. The changing temperature of air currents. The vast shadows of clouds drifting across rivers. Even his own breathing seemed louder now. For brief moments, he forgot the urge to speak entirely. And in those moments, peace touched him. Had the journey ended there, perhaps the turtle's fate might have changed, but destiny often waits patiently until the exact moment pride begins to weaken. By midday, the golden towers of Benares appeared upon the horizon. The city shimmered beneath sunlight like a field of burning copper. Temple spires pierced the sky. Palace roofs flashed with gold. Marketplaces overflowed with movement, color, animals, carts, smoke, and human voices. The turtle stared downward in wonder. So many people. So much noise. So much restless movement. The geese descended slightly as they crossed above the outer districts of the city. Below them, people began pointing upward. At first, only a few children noticed. Then merchants. Then laborers. Then entire crowds stopped moving. A murmur spread through the streets. What is that? Look! 2 geese carrying a turtle. Laughter erupted. The sight was absurd. A turtle hanging helplessly from a stick between 2 birds looked ridiculous against the royal sky of Benares. Children clapped wildly. Some men shouted jokes. Women covered their mouths, laughing openly. Even guards atop the palace walls pointed upward with amusement. The turtle heard every word. At first, he tried to ignore them. The branch remained firm between his jaws. But then someone shouted loudly from below, "Perhaps the turtle is their king." The crowd roared with laughter. Another voice called, "No, the birds must be punishing him for talking too much." More laughter. The turtle's eyes widened. Heat surged through his chest. Something ancient and dangerous awakened inside him. Pride. The desperate human need to defend the self. He tried to remain calm. He tried to remember the warning. But the voices below multiplied like insects. Stupid turtle. How foolish he looks. Look at his face. Laughter echoed through the streets. And suddenly, silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt humiliating. The turtle's heart pounded violently. Why should they mock him? What right did they have? They knew nothing of him. Nothing of the mountains. Nothing of the courage required to leave one's home behind. Anger rose faster than wisdom. As it often does. One of the geese sensed the tension immediately. She glanced toward the turtle with quiet alarm. Her eyes pleaded with him. Do not speak. Please. But anger makes beings deaf. Especially anger born from wounded pride. The turtle's thoughts became wildfire. I must answer them. I must defend myself. I must prove them wrong. The urge swelled inside him until it consumed every other thought. At last, the turtle opened his mouth. You fools! What business is it of yours? The branch slipped instantly from his jaws. For one terrible moment, the world became silent. The turtle's eyes widened in horror. Wind exploded around him. The sky vanished. And suddenly, he was falling. Far below, Inside the royal palace of Benares, King Brahmadatta sat beneath a canopy of silk listening impatiently to his ministers. The king loved speaking more than listening. Every conversation eventually returned to himself. Every discussion became tangled beneath endless commentary. His ministers had learned long ago that silence was safer than contradiction. Yet among them sat one young man unlike the others. The minister's son. Wise beyond his years. Observant. Patient. For many months, he had searched for a way to teach the king the danger of uncontrolled speech. But kings rarely learn through argument. Pride seals the ears more tightly than wax. So the young minister waited. And above the palace courtyard, destiny descended screaming from the sky. The turtle crashed upon the stone with a sickening sound. The courtyard erupted into chaos. Servants shouted. Guards rushed forward. Feathers spiraled through the air as the two geese circled helplessly above. The turtle lay motionless upon the ground. His shell cracked. Blood darkened the white stone. And all because of a single sentence that did not need to be spoken. The king stood abruptly. What happened here? No one answered immediately. The crowd stared upward in disbelief at the departing geese. Then the young minister slowly stepped forward. He bowed respectfully. And at last, he understood that the moment he had waited for had finally arrived. The courtyard of the palace fell into an uneasy silence. Dust drifted slowly through shafts of afternoon light. Servants stood frozen beside overturned baskets of fruit. Guards stared at the shattered turtle with expressions caught somewhere between horror and disbelief. Above them, the two wild geese circled once more. Their cries echoed across the palace roofs, long, mournful sounds that seemed less like the voices of birds and more like grief itself carried upon the wind. Then, at last, they turned toward the northern mountains and disappeared into the sky. The turtle lay motionless. Blood crept slowly through the cracks of white stone. King Brahmadatta stepped down from his throne platform with visible irritation. His jeweled robes rustled sharply behind him as he approached the dead creature. "What foolishness is this?" the king muttered. "How does a turtle fall from the sky?" No one answered immediately. Because in royal courts, truth often moved carefully. Especially around kings who loved hearing their own voices more than listening to others. The ministers lowered their eyes. The servants trembled quietly. Yet among them stood the minister's son, calm and observant. He looked not at the turtle first, but at the king. For many years, he had studied the strange nature of speech. How words could soothe fear. How they could ignite wars. How one sentence could save a life, and another could destroy an empire. But most dangerous of all, he understood this: those who speak constantly eventually stop hearing. The young minister had watched King Brahmadatta rule exactly in this manner. The king was not evil. Cruel rulers could at least be resisted openly. But Brahmadatta possessed a subtler flaw. He drowned the world beneath endless speech. Every council meeting stretched for hours while the king repeated himself again and again. Advisors rarely finished their thoughts before interruption arrived. Important warnings disappeared beneath floods of unnecessary commentary. Even during ceremonies, the king could not remain silent. When priests prayed, he added corrections. When generals reported, he interrupted with stories of his own wisdom. When musicians played, he spoke over the music itself. Silence unsettled him. And because silence frightened him, he filled every empty space with words. The young minister had long understood that such habits eventually lead rulers toward ruin. Because a mind addicted to speaking loses the ability to observe. And a king who cannot observe becomes blind long before he notices darkness approaching. Now, standing before the broken turtle, the minister's son finally saw an opportunity. Not to humiliate the king, but perhaps to awaken him. The king turned impatiently toward the court. "Well," he demanded, "explain this absurdity." The ministers exchanged nervous glances. No one wished to speak first. At last, the young minister stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "this turtle died because it could not master its tongue." The king frowned. "What does that mean?" The young minister gestured toward the sky. 2 geese carried the turtle through the air using a branch. The turtle likely promised to remain silent during the journey. The king crossed his arms. "Likely?" The minister nodded respectfully. "Yes, Your Majesty. For had it remained silent, it would still live." A murmur passed through the courtyard. The king looked again at the shattered shell. For a brief moment, something thoughtful flickered behind his eyes. But only briefly. Then he laughed loudly. So the creature was a fool. Some courtiers forced nervous smiles. But the minister did not laugh. Instead, he spoke carefully. "Majesty, many beings destroy themselves not through lack of intelligence, but through lack of restraint." The courtyard became still again. The king narrowed his eyes slightly. The minister continued, "A fire begins with only a spark. A flood begins with only a drop. and suffering often begins with only a single unnecessary word. The king's expression hardened faintly. Courtiers shifted uneasily. Everyone understood the danger now. The young minister was not merely discussing a turtle. He was approaching the king himself. Yet the minister's voice remained calm, respectful, gentle. Because truth enters the heart more easily when not sharpened into accusation. The king studied him carefully. "You speak boldly today." The minister bowed once more. "I speak only because your majesty values wisdom." This answer pleased the king slightly. Pride softened his suspicion. "Then continue," Brahmadatta said. The minister glanced toward the dead turtle. "In this world, Majesty, many fear silence because silence reveals the mind. When speech stops, one begins hearing desire, fear, anger, regret. Many speak endlessly not because they possess wisdom, but because they are fleeing themselves." The wind moved quietly through the courtyard banners. Several older ministers lowered their eyes. The word struck too close to truth. The young minister continued carefully, "A disciplined mind speaks when necessary. But an undisciplined mind speaks simply because silence feels uncomfortable." King Brahmadatta said nothing, which itself was unusual. The minister sensed the opening and stepped closer. "Majesty, may I ask a question?" The king nodded cautiously. "When two men argue endlessly, who truly suffers first?" The king answered immediately. "Both." The minister bowed. "And when a ruler speaks constantly without listening, who suffers then?" The king's expression darkened slightly. But before irritation could rise, the minister spoke again. "A kingdom, Majesty." The silence that followed felt heavier than stone. Even the servant stopped breathing. For a dangerous moment, no one knew whether the king would erupt in anger. Because kings often punish truths they are unwilling to face. But the young minister had chosen his words carefully. He had not accused. He had invited reflection. There is great power in the difference. King Brahmadatta slowly turned toward the dead turtle once more. Its mouth still hung open slightly, as though frozen forever in the final moment before destruction. The king stared at it for a long time, then finally asked, "Do you believe words alone can destroy a man?" The minister answered softly, "Majesty, words reveal the mind that destroys the man." The king fell silent again. A strange discomfort moved through him now. Not anger. Something deeper. Recognition. Because somewhere within himself, he knew the minister spoke truth. He remembered interrupted advisors, ignored warnings, conversations in which no one truly spoke honestly around him anymore. Not because they lacked thoughts, but because they feared his endless reactions. The realization unsettled him. For the first time in many years, King Brahmadatta became aware of the sound of the wind. It moved gently through the palace trees, soft, unhurried, unconcerned with proving anything. The king suddenly understood how noisy his life had become. And beneath that noise, how tired he truly was. Meanwhile, far beyond the palace walls, the city of Benares continued roaring with life. Markets shouted. Oxen groaned beneath heavy carts. Merchants argued over grain and silk. Children screamed through narrow alleys. Priests chanted. Drums echoed from distant temples. Everywhere, sound. Endless sound. The young minister looked toward the city horizon. Then he spoke one final time. Majesty, most beings believe power comes from being heard. But true power often begins with the ability to remain silent. The king looked at him slowly. And silence alone creates wisdom. The minister smiled faintly. No, Majesty. But silence creates the space in which wisdom may finally enter. The afternoon sun drifted lower. Long shadows stretched across the palace stones. At last, King Brahmadatta turned away from the dead turtle. Have the creature buried respectfully, he ordered quietly. The servants bowed immediately. Yet many within the courtyard noticed something unusual. The king's voice had changed. Only slightly. But enough. Less forceful. Less eager. As though somewhere deep within him, a crack had appeared. And through that crack, stillness had entered for the first time. Many centuries later, beneath the dark trees of Jetavana Monastery, the Buddha paused. The monks listened without movement. Some felt shame remembering their own arguments earlier that day. Others reflected upon how often they themselves spoke merely to defend pride. The Blessed One looked upon them with compassion. Then he said softly, Bhikkhus, a reckless tongue destroys peace faster than fire burns dry grass. The night deepened around the monastery. And once more, silence became the teacher. That night, King Brahmadatta could not sleep. The palace had grown quiet hours ago. Servants had withdrawn into shadowed corridors. Musicians had long since stopped playing. Even the fountains within the royal garden seemed softer beneath the moonlight. Yet the king remained awake. Alone beneath silk curtains and golden lanterns. The image of the broken turtle refused to leave his mind. Again and again, he saw its mouth opening. That single fatal moment. The desperate need to answer. To defend itself. To speak. The king turned upon his bed with growing irritation. Why should such a foolish creature trouble him? He was ruler of Benares, master of armies, owner of treasures beyond counting. Men bowed when he entered rooms. Priests praised his name before crowds. Yet now, a dead turtle disturbed his peace more than matters of war. The king sat upright suddenly. Outside the open balcony, moonlight covered the palace gardens in pale silver. Tall trees swayed gently in the warm night wind. Somewhere beyond the walls, distant dogs barked in the sleeping city. And beneath all those sounds, there was something else. A silence. Thin at first. Barely noticeable. Yet once the king became aware of it, he could not ignore it anymore. He frowned. For years, he had filled every moment with noise. Conversation. Music. Debate. Orders. Entertainment. He spoke during meals. He spoke during ceremonies. He even spoke to himself while walking alone. Now, in the stillness of midnight, he suddenly realized something deeply unsettling. He did not know how to be quiet. The thought disturbed him more than he wished to admit. The king rose from his bed and walked slowly onto the balcony. The city of Benares stretched endlessly beneath the moon. Thousands of homes, thousands of sleeping lives. For the first time in many years, the king did not feel powerful looking at his kingdom. He felt distant from it, as though noise itself had become a wall between him and the world. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. When he was a child, before becoming king, he once wandered alone beside a river at dusk. He remembered sitting silently for nearly an hour watching lotus leaves drift upon black water. At the time, the silence had felt beautiful, peaceful, alive. When had he lost that feeling? When had silence become unbearable? The king did not know. Behind him, soft footsteps approached. An old servant bowed respectfully near the doorway. "Your Majesty, would you like musicians brought to ease your mind?" The king almost answered yes immediately. Music. Voices. Anything to drown the strange discomfort rising inside him. But then he remembered the turtle. The endless need to respond. To escape silence. Slowly, the king shook his head. "No." The servant looked surprised. "Then perhaps storytellers? Dancers? Tea?" Again the king nearly accepted. Again he stopped himself. "No." The servant hesitated. The king suddenly understood something terrible. Everyone around him had spent years protecting him from silence, because they believed silence itself was a form of suffering. And perhaps, for the king, it had become exactly that. At last, the servant withdrew quietly. The king stood alone beneath the moon. Minutes passed. Then more. At first, the silence clawed at him. Thoughts rose uncontrollably. Unfinished conversations. Insults remembered from years ago. Fears about neighboring kingdoms. Anxieties about succession. The stupidity of certain ministers. The uncertainty of aging. His mind leapt endlessly from one thought to another like a monkey trapped inside fire. The king suddenly understood why most people avoid silence. Because silence reveals the chaos already living within them. Without distraction, the mind becomes impossible to escape. A cold wind passed across the balcony. The king closed his eyes. And for the first time in many years, he listened. Not to others. Not to praise. Not to arguments. But to the movement of his own mind. It frightened him. Because beneath all the noise of his life, he discovered exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion. Something deeper. The exhaustion of constantly defending oneself. Constantly speaking. Constantly proving importance. He whispered quietly into the darkness, "When did I become so tired?" No one answered. Yet strangely, the silence itself felt different now. Not empty. Not hostile. Only honest. Meanwhile, across the palace grounds, the minister's son remained awake as well. He sat alone beneath a lantern inside his small chamber surrounded by rolled manuscripts and unfinished letters. The young minister understood something delicate had occurred earlier that day. A door had opened within the king, only slightly. But enough. The danger now was not anger. It was retreat. Many people touch truth briefly, then flee from it the moment discomfort appears. Real transformation requires courage. And silence requires perhaps the greatest courage of all. Because silence removes distraction. And without distraction, one must finally meet oneself. The young minister gazed toward the moonlit palace towers. He remembered the turtle falling from the sky. But more importantly, he remembered the expression on the king's face afterward. Not pride. Not amusement. Recognition. As though the king had suddenly glimpsed his own reflection inside the dead creature. The minister folded his hands quietly. He knew change could not be forced. Wisdom enters like dawn. Slowly. Almost invisibly. Elsewhere in the city, life continued in ignorance. Drunken men argued loudly outside wine houses. Merchants whispered greedily over coin. Lovers made promises they would later break. priests recited prayers without hearing their own words. Everywhere, mouths moved endlessly. Yet very few truly listened. The night deepened. Clouds passed slowly across the moon, and in the center of the royal palace, King Brahmadatta remained standing alone upon the balcony, surrounded at last by the one thing he had spent his entire life avoiding. Silence. Hours passed. At some point, the king noticed something remarkable. The silence no longer felt unbearable. His thoughts still moved restlessly, but the urgency to escape them had weakened slightly. The wind touched his face. Cool. Gentle. Alive. Below him, the gardens breathed softly beneath moonlight. For the first time in years, the king simply watched. Without speaking. Without commanding. Without explaining. And within that stillness, a tiny space opened inside him. A space untouched by performance. Untouched by power. Untouched by fear. Small as the first crack in winter ice. Yet enough. Enough for wisdom to begin entering. Far away, beyond the sleeping city, the Himalayas stood beneath the stars. Silent as eternity. The same mountains the turtle had once dreamed of reaching. The same mountains where sages disappeared for decades seeking freedom from the noise of the world. And high above those ancient peaks, the night sky stretched endlessly outward. Wordless. Vast, watching all beings struggle beneath the weight of their own minds. Back in Jetavana Monastery, the Buddha looked upon the monks gathered before him. Some sat with lowered heads. Others listened with tears quietly forming in their eyes. Because many had entered monastic life believing suffering came from the outside world. From enemies. From hunger. From loss. But slowly, through practice, they discovered a more difficult truth: the loudest prison often exists within the mind itself. The Buddha spoke softly into the darkness. Because the untamed mind fears silence because silence reveals attachment. A lamp flickered beside him. Meditation does not create peace. It reveals the peace already hidden beneath noise. The monks listened carefully. Outside, the night wind moved through the trees like distant breathing. And for a little while longer, no one wished to speak. Several days passed after the turtle's death. Something subtle had changed within the palace of Benares. At first, no one dared speak of it openly. Kings were dangerous even when gentle. And when a ruler began changing inwardly, wise people observed carefully before drawing conclusions. Yet slowly, the difference became impossible to ignore. King Brahmadatta had begun listening. Not perfectly. Not always. But enough to unsettle the entire court. During council meetings, ministers occasionally finished sentences without interruption. Military advisors discovered the king sometimes paused before answering. Once, during a debate over taxes, Brahmadatta remained silent for nearly an entire minute while considering two opposing arguments. The silence terrified everyone more than his anger once had. Courtiers exchanged nervous glances. Some believed the king had become ill. Others whispered of curses. One priest privately claimed the falling turtle had been a divine omen sent by the gods. But the minister's son understood the truth more clearly. The king was hearing his own mind for the first time, and the experience was painful. Transformation rarely begins with peace. It usually begins with discomfort. One evening, as crimson sunlight faded across the western sky, King Brahmadatta summoned the young minister privately to the palace gardens. The garden stretched wide beside a lotus pond illuminated by floating lamps. Jasmine scented the warm night air. Tall banyan trees cast enormous shadows over stone pathways worn smooth by generations of royal footsteps. The king stood beside the water with his hands behind his back. For a while, he said nothing. The minister waited patiently. At last, Brahmadatta spoke. "When I was young," he said quietly, "people described me as thoughtful." The minister remained silent. The king gave a bitter smile. "Now they describe me as loud." A soft wind stirred the lotus leaves. The minister answered carefully. "Majesty, many people spend years speaking before realizing they have forgotten how to listen." The king nodded slowly. "I have begun noticing things." "What things, Majesty?" The king looked into the black water. "How restless my mind is." The minister did not seem surprised. The king continued, "When silence comes, thoughts appear endlessly. Fear, memory, regret, desire." He frowned deeply. "Has my mind always been this noisy?" The minister stepped closer beside the pond. "Yes, Majesty." "Then why did I not see it before?" "Because noise concealed noise." The king fell quiet again. A frog called somewhere near the reeds. Far away, musicians played faintly within the palace halls. Yet between those sounds, something new existed now around the king. Space. The minister spoke gently, "Majesty, Most people believe silence is the absence of sound, but true silence is something deeper. The king looked toward him. What do you mean? The minister pointed toward the lotus pond. The surface of water cannot reflect clearly while constantly disturbed. Neither can the mind. The king watched the dark ripples slowly spreading across the pond. And how does one calm the mind? He asked. The minister smiled faintly. One does not force stillness. One stops feeding restlessness. The words settled softly into the evening air. The king lowered his gaze again. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, "Tell me honestly." The minister bowed slightly. "Always, Majesty." "Do my people fear me?" The question lingered heavily between them. Many rulers ask whether they are loved. Few ask whether they are feared. And fewer still truly wish to know the answer. The minister chose his words carefully. They fear your reactions more than your punishments. The king closed his eyes briefly. The answer wounded him because it was true. He remembered countless moments, interrupting advisors, mocking hesitation, speaking so forcefully that others abandoned honesty entirely. Without realizing it, he had trained his kingdom into silence. Not peaceful silence. Fearful silence. The king whispered, "And I believed myself wise." The minister looked toward the moon rising above the gardens. "Majesty, wisdom begins the moment one recognizes ignorance." The king gave a tired laugh. "You speak like an old monk trapped inside a young man." The minister smiled politely. "Perhaps truth ages faster than the body." For the first time in many years, the king laughed softly without arrogance. And the sound felt lighter. More human. They walked slowly through the gardens beneath hanging lanterns. After some time, the king spoke again. The turtle wished to reach the mountains. "Yes, Majesty." "The golden cave." The minister nodded. The king stared upward toward the stars. "Do you think such places truly exist?" The minister followed his gaze northward. Beyond the city, beyond the plains, beyond human ambition and noise, the Himalayas waited beneath eternal snow. "Yes," the minister answered quietly. "I believe they do." The king fell silent. And in that silence, something unexpected stirred inside him. Longing. Not for conquest. Not for wealth. But for peace. The same peace the turtle had glimpsed briefly during flight. The same peace sages pursued by abandoning cities and kingdoms. The same peace hidden beneath the endless noise of human desire. Meanwhile, high within the distant Himalayas, the two wild geese returned alone to the hidden golden cave. The cave rested beside a dark mountain lake untouched by human feet. Veins of natural gold shimmered faintly within the stone walls, glowing softly whenever moonlight entered the cavern mouth. Ancient pine trees surrounded the valley. Snow drifted silently through cold air. Everything there moved slowly. Even time itself seemed quieter. The geese settled beside the lake in silence. For a long while, neither spoke. At last, one whispered sadly, "He almost found peace." The other lowered her head. Yes. They both understood the deeper tragedy. The turtle had not died because others mocked him. He died because he could not endure the discomfort inside himself. The insults merely revealed the weakness already waiting within him. As all insults do. The mountains remained silent around them. Because nature does not argue. The wind does not defend itself. The moon does not explain its brightness. Only human beings believe every wound requires a response. Far below, across kingdoms and villages, countless beings continued exhausting themselves through unnecessary conflict. Arguments, defenses, explanations. Pride speaking endlessly to pride. And somewhere beneath all that noise, peace waited patiently. Like a hidden cave beyond the clouds. A place most beings never reach. Not because the path is impossible, but because silence feels too frightening before arrival. Back in Jataka Monastery, the Buddha looked at the monks gathered around him. The oil lamps had nearly burned out now. The forest beyond the monastery walls had become completely dark. One young monk finally bowed and asked softly, "Blessed One, if silence is so valuable, should we never speak?" The Buddha smiled gently. "No, Bhikkhu. Speech used wisely can relieve suffering. Truth spoken with compassion is a great gift." He paused. But speech arising from pride, fear, anger, or restlessness. He looked toward the night sky. Becomes a chain binding the mind to suffering. The monks sat motionless. The Buddha's voice softened even further. Before speaking, one should ask, is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? And perhaps most importantly, the Blessed One closed his eyes briefly. Does silence already say enough? The night wind moved through Jetavana like invisible water. And beneath the vast darkness of the world, the monks listened to the sound of their own breathing. The rains arrived early that year in Benares. Clouds gathered heavily above the kingdom for days before the first storm finally broke across the city. Thunder rolled through the sky like distant mountains collapsing. Rain poured from heaven in silver curtains, washing dust from palace roofs and flooding narrow streets below. The people welcomed it joyfully. Children ran laughing through muddy alleys. Farmers lifted their faces toward the storm with gratitude. Even the exhausted earth seemed to breathe again. Inside the palace, however, the rain carried another effect. It created silence. The constant roar of falling water muffled conversation. Courtyards emptied. Musicians played less often. Even arguments softened beneath the steady rhythm of rain against stone. And within that strange quietness, King Brahmadatta found himself increasingly unsettled. Because now there was no escaping the sound of his own thoughts. Night after night, he stood beside the open windows of his chambers listening to rainfall spread across the kingdom like endless whispering. At first, the silence between sounds still frightened him. But slowly, something else began emerging. Awareness. The king started noticing how quickly his mind reacted to everything. A servant's hesitation irritated him instantly. A minister's disagreement awakened defensiveness. A small insult echoed in memory for hours. It was as though an invisible fire constantly waited beneath his skin. Before, he had never seen this clearly. Because endless speech had distracted him. Now silence acted like a mirror. And the reflection was not comfortable. One morning, unable to bear the palace any longer, the king disguised himself in plain robes and left the royal grounds with only a single guard following at a distance. He told no one. Not even the minister's son. The rain had stopped briefly, leaving the city washed clean beneath gray skies. Water dripped from rooftops. Temple bells echoed softly through damp air. The king wandered without destination. For years, he had ruled Benares while barely seeing it. Now, moving anonymously through the streets, he noticed things he had long forgotten. Old women carrying water with trembling hands. Hungry children staring silently beside market stalls. Laborers sleeping beneath woven cloth awnings. A blind musician playing flute beside a flooded alleyway. The king slowed. No one bowed. No one praised him. No one rushed to fill silence with pleasing words. And strangely, he felt relief. Eventually, the king reached the outer districts near the riverbanks where the city gave way to forests and small farming villages. There, beneath an enormous banyan tree beside the river, sat an old monk. The monk wore faded robes the color of wet earth. Rainwater dripped steadily from the tree branches around him. His eyes remained closed, completely still. The king stopped walking. Something about the old monk unsettled him immediately. not because of power, but because of peace. The monk's silence did not feel empty. It felt alive, like deep water unmoved by storms above. The king watched for several moments. The monk did not react. At last, irritated by being ignored, the king spoke. "Old man." No response. The king frowned. "Are you asleep?" Still nothing. The king stepped closer. "How can you sit alone in silence for so long?" Slowly, the monk opened his eyes. They were calm, clear, almost unbearably calm. The monk studied the stranger before him without judgment. Then he smiled gently. "Because I am no longer running." The answer confused the king. Running from what? The monk looked toward the river. Most people spend their lives fleeing their own minds. Rainwater flowed steadily past stones and roots. The king crossed his arms. "And sitting beneath a tree changes this?" The monk chuckled softly. "No." "Then what does?" The monk's smile deepened slightly. "Seeing clearly." The king grew impatient. The answer sounded simple. Too simple. Yet something about the old man's presence made argument difficult. The monk motioned toward the ground beside him. "Sit." The king hesitated. No one commanded him. Ever. Yet after a moment, he lowered himself reluctantly beneath the banyan tree. The air smelled of rain and wet earth. For a while, neither spoke. The silence quickly became uncomfortable. The king's thoughts rushed wildly again. "This is pointless. Who is this man? I should return to the palace. What if someone recognizes me? Why is he saying nothing?" Finally, unable to tolerate it, the king burst out, "How do you stop the mind from thinking?" The monk laughed softly. "You do not." The king frowned. "Then what is the purpose of silence?" The monk picked up a fallen leaf floating in a puddle. When muddy water is left undisturbed, it clears by itself. The king stared at the puddle silently. The monk continued, "The problem is not thought itself. It is attachment to thought. Most people believe every emotion deserves reaction. Every insult deserves defense. Every fear deserves obedience." The monk looked directly into the king's eyes now. "But the mind is only weather." The word struck something deep within him. The monk placed the leaf gently back into the water. Storms arise. Storms pass. The sky remains. The king suddenly remembered the turtle again. Its desperate need to answer the crowd below. Its inability to allow mockery to pass like wind. And in that moment, the king understood something painful. The turtle had not fallen because of words. It had fallen because it believed the words mattered. Rain began falling again softly through the banyan leaves. The monk closed his eyes once more. The king sat motionless. Something inside him was beginning to loosen. Not pride entirely. Not fear entirely. But the unquestioned belief that every thought required action. For the first time in many years, the king simply watched the rain. Without judgment. Without commentary. Without needing to explain what he felt. And strangely, the world appeared more beautiful in silence. The monk spoke again without opening his eyes. Most men think peace comes after controlling the world. A faint smile touched his lips. But peace begins when one stops allowing the world to control the mind. The rain intensified around them. The river flowed dark and endless beside the banyan roots. And there beneath the storm, the king remained sitting quietly beside a man who possessed absolutely nothing, yet seemed freer than any ruler alive. That evening, when King Brahmadatta returned to the palace, the minister's son immediately noticed something different. The king's movements had slowed. His face appeared thoughtful rather than restless. And most unusual of all, he no longer seemed afraid of pauses in conversation. During supper, several moments of silence passed naturally. No one rushed to fill them. The court felt uncertain, almost nervous. Yet beneath the uncertainty, another feeling quietly emerged. Relief. Because silence, when no longer born from fear, becomes rest. Back in Jetavana Monastery, rain also fell softly through the forest surrounding the monks. The Buddha sat unmoving beneath the dim oil lamps. The younger bhikkhus listened with complete attention now. Many of them were beginning to recognize the turtle within themselves. The endless need to respond. To defend. To explain. The Blessed One spoke gently. Bhikkhus, wisdom does not come from winning arguments. It comes from understanding the mind that wishes to argue. Rain tapped softly upon the monastery roofs. One who conquers others may still suffer greatly. But one who understands his own mind. The Buddha's eyes reflected the lamp light like still water. Has already begun walking toward freedom. No one spoke afterward. Because for the first time that night, the monks understood that silence was not emptiness. It was a doorway. The rain season deepened across the kingdom. Weeks passed beneath gray skies and drifting mist. Rivers swelled beyond their banks. Forest paths disappeared beneath mud and flowing water. The air itself seemed slower now, softened by endless rain. And within the palace of Benares, a quiet transformation continued. At first, few understood it. Even King Brahmadatta himself could not fully explain what was happening inside him. He still became irritated. Still felt pride. Still caught himself preparing arguments in his mind before others finished speaking. Yet something fundamental had begun changing. For the first time in his life, he noticed these things while they were happening. And that small awareness altered everything. Previously, his anger had moved like wildfire. Instant. Unquestioned. Now, sometimes, there existed a pause. Only a breath. A tiny space between emotion and action. But within that space, choice became possible. One afternoon during royal council, two ministers began arguing fiercely over grain distribution after severe flooding destroyed several villages near the eastern river. Voices rose quickly. One blamed the local governors. The other demanded increased taxation. Soon both men were speaking over each other, their fear disguising itself as certainty. Normally, the king would have interrupted immediately, or chosen a side impulsively, or shouted simply to regain control. Instead, Brahmadatta remained silent. The entire court slowly fell uneasy beneath his stillness. The arguing ministers eventually stopped on their own. Not because they had solved anything, but because the silence revealed how foolish they sounded. The king looked at both men calmly. Then he asked a simple question. Are either of you listening? Neither answered. Because both knew the truth. They had only been waiting for opportunities to speak. The king leaned back slowly upon his throne. Rain tapped softly against distant palace windows. When a mind is full of itself, he said quietly, it cannot receive wisdom. The court stared in stunned silence. Many had never heard the king speak this way before. Without force. Without performance. Without needing dominance hidden beneath every sentence. The minister's son lowered his eyes slightly, concealing a faint smile. The king was beginning to understand. Not perfectly, but genuinely. After the council ended, Brahmadatta walked alone through the palace corridors. He noticed something strange. The palace itself sounded different now. For years he had believed power meant filling every silence with authority. Yet now, in quieter moments, he heard things previously drowned beneath endless conversation. Wind moving through carved stone arches. Birds resting beneath roof beams. Distant footsteps echoing softly. The rustle of silk robes. Even silence itself seemed textured now. Alive. The king paused beside an open window overlooking the rain-soaked gardens. He remembered the old monk beneath the banyan tree. The mind is only weather. At first, the words had seemed simple. Now they felt endless. Thoughts came. Thoughts passed. Anger came. Fear came. Desire came. And all of them eventually disappeared again like storms crossing the sky. So why had he spent his entire life obeying every passing cloud? The king closed his eyes. For a brief moment, he experienced something unfamiliar. Stillness. Not complete stillness. But enough. Enough to realize peace was not something added to life. It appeared naturally when noise stopped consuming everything. That evening, the minister's son was invited once again to dine privately with the king. Unlike previous royal dinners filled with musicians, entertainers, and endless political discussion, this meal unfolded quietly. Simple food. Warm lantern light. Rain beyond the windows. At one point, nearly an entire minute passed without speech. Years ago, such silence would have terrified Brahmadatta. Now he simply drank tea slowly and listened to rainwater dripping from stone gutters. Finally, the king spoke. "Tell me something honestly." The minister bowed slightly. "Of course, Majesty." The king stared into his cup. How many problems in this kingdom are caused by people speaking too much? The minister almost laughed. But seeing the sincerity in the king's face, he answered carefully. Most suffering begins when people speak from confusion rather than understanding. The king nodded slowly. Yes. He looked toward the rain-darkened gardens. I am beginning to see that words are dangerous. The minister considered this. Words are powerful, Majesty, but power itself is neither good nor bad. He paused briefly. A sword may defend life or destroy it. So may speech. The king turned toward him thoughtfully. Then why do people speak carelessly? The minister smiled faintly. Because silence reveals insecurity. The king frowned slightly. Explain. The young man folded his hands calmly. When people speak endlessly, they often seek protection. Protection from uncertainty. Protection from insignificance. Protection from themselves. The king fell quiet. The words pierced deeply because he recognized himself within them. For years, he had used speech as armor. As distraction. As proof of importance. Every argument won. Every opinion announced. Every silence conquered. Yet beneath all of it had lived fear. Fear of being ignored. Fear of weakness. Fear of emptiness. The king whispered softly, so the loudest people are often the most afraid. The minister nodded. Yes, Majesty. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the distant hills. The king looked toward the darkness beyond the palace. Do you think true peace is possible for someone like me? The question hung heavily in the air. Not as a king, but as a human being. The minister answered gently. Peace does not belong only to monks or sages. It belongs to anyone willing to see clearly. The king closed his eyes briefly. Then he laughed quietly to himself. All my life, I believed wisdom meant having answers. The minister smiled. And now? The king opened his eyes. Now I think wisdom may begin with learning not to speak unnecessarily. The two men sat together listening to rain. And for the first time, the king no longer feared the silence between words. Meanwhile, far away beyond the kingdom, high within the snow mountains, the hidden golden cave remained untouched by human noise. Moonlight entered through narrow openings in the stone ceiling, reflecting softly across the underground lake. The two wild geese slept peacefully near the water's edge. No arguments existed there. No pride. No endless explanations. Only wind, snow, breath, silence. The kind of silence the turtle had almost reached, had almost understood. Yet perhaps, not completely lost. Because even failure can become wisdom if truly seen. Back in Benares, the storm clouds slowly began to clear. And above the palace rooftops, for the first time in many weeks, stars emerged quietly between the fading clouds. The king stood alone upon his balcony once more. But this time, the silence felt different. Not like loneliness. Not like absence. But like space vast enough to finally breathe. He looked upward toward the stars. Toward the unseen mountains far beyond the horizon. And softly, almost like a prayer, he whispered, I understand now. Not completely. Not perfectly. But enough for the journey to begin. Back in Jetavana Monastery, the Buddha looked slowly across the gathered monks. Many sat unusually still now. The story had entered them deeply. Because every monk recognized moments in his own life when suffering arose not from great tragedy, but from unnecessary words. A careless insult. An angry reply. A desperate need to defend pride. The Blessed One spoke softly, Bhikkhu, a burning forest may begin from a single spark. So too can suffering arise from a single careless sentence. The monks listened closely. One who masters silence does not become empty. He becomes careful. The Buddha lowered his eyes gently. And careful speech is a form of compassion. Outside, rainwater dripped slowly from the monastery roofs into dark earth below. The forest breathed quietly around them. And beneath the silence of the night, something within the monks had also begun to quiet. The rains ended slowly. Not with sudden sunlight or dramatic skies, but gradually. Day after day, the storms weakened. The clouds became thinner. The rivers settled back into their ancient paths. Birds returned to palace rooftops. The scent of wet earth lingered softly across the kingdom. And with the passing of the rains, another storm also began fading. The storm inside King Brahmadatta. Not completely. Not permanently. But enough that others could feel it. The palace itself seemed lighter now. Servants no longer trembled so quickly when speaking near the throne. Ministers discovered they could disagree without immediate humiliation. Even the guard standing beside the royal hall sensed the atmosphere changing. Fear was loosening its grip. And where fear weakens, truth begins breathing again. Yet transformation is never smooth. Some days the king remained calm and thoughtful. Other days, old habits returned violently. He interrupted people, spoke too quickly, defended himself unnecessarily. Afterward, shame would follow. At first, this discouraged him deeply. One evening he confessed this frustration to the minister's son while they walked together beneath lanterns in the royal garden. "I understand silence now," the king said bitterly. "But I still fail." Moonlight shimmered across the lotus pond beside them. The young minister smiled gently. "Majesty, seeing one's own confusion is already wisdom." The king shook his head impatiently. "No. If wisdom had truly entered me, I would no longer lose control." The minister stopped walking. Then quietly asked, "When a child first learns to walk, do you condemn him each time he falls?" The king frowned slightly. "Of course not." "Then why show yourself less compassion than you would show a child?" The word struck deeply. The king lowered his eyes. Because for many years, he had believed harshness created strength. Toward others. Toward himself. Yet harshness had never brought him peace. Only exhaustion. The minister continued softly, "Majesty, the mind has followed certain habits for many years. Habits of pride, fear, reaction. One does not uproot a forest in a single night." The king breathed slowly. The night air felt cool after the long season of rain. For a while they walked without speaking. And now, unlike before, the silence between them felt natural. At last the king asked quietly, "Do you think the turtle suffered while falling?" The minister considered the question carefully. "Yes. Probably for one terrible moment." The king nodded sadly. Because in that instant, it finally understood. The minister said nothing. Some truths require silence more than agreement. The king stopped beside the lotus pond. Reflections of stars trembled gently across the dark water. "All my life," he whispered, "I thought suffering came from not having enough. More power, more certainty, more respect." He looked toward the sky. "But now I begin to wonder if suffering comes from never being satisfied." The minister's eyes softened. Desire always promises peace later. But peace only exists now. The king closed his eyes. For years, he had chased future peace. Peace after victory. Peace after praise. Peace after control. Yet every achievement only created new hunger. Like drinking salt water. The more he consumed, the thirstier he became. A cool breeze crossed the garden. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, temple bells rang softly through the night. The king listened quietly. And for the first time in many years, he did not feel the need to become anything else. Not wiser. Not stronger. Not admired. Only present. Only alive. The minister spoke again, "Majesty, most people believe peace is the absence of difficulty. But true peace is the ability to remain undisturbed within difficulty." The king opened his eyes slowly. The words settled inside him like falling snow. He suddenly understood why the old monk beneath the banyan tree had seemed so free. The monk had not escaped life. He had simply stopped fighting every passing storm within his mind. The king smiled faintly. A difficult lesson. The minister bowed his head slightly. "Yes. But a beautiful one." That night, after returning to his chambers, King Brahmadatta dismissed the servants early. No musicians. No wine. No storytellers. Only silence. The palace corridors gradually darkened as lamps burned low. Outside, the final clouds drifted apart, revealing a vast sky filled with stars. The king stood alone beside the open balcony. The city slept peacefully beneath him. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, the Himalayas waited silently beneath moonlight. The mountains the turtle had never reached. The mountain sages crossed kingdoms searching for. The mountains that asked nothing from anyone. Only stillness. The king sat slowly upon the floor beside the balcony. No throne. No ceremony. Just a human being breathing quietly beneath the night sky. Thoughts still appeared. Memories. Fears. Regrets. But now he saw them differently. Not commands. Only weather. They came, they passed. He did not follow them. The night deepened. Wind moved softly through silk curtains. And gradually, something extraordinary happened. The king's mind became quiet. Not forced silence. Not exhaustion. Something deeper. Like muddy water finally settling after years of disturbance. For the first time since his youth, King Brahmadatta fell asleep peacefully. No nightmares. No anxious turning. No restless thoughts chasing each other through darkness. Only sleep. Simple. Gentle. Human sleep. And while the king rested, the palace itself seemed to exhale. Servants walked more softly. The guards outside his chamber exchanged relieved glances. Even the night air felt calmer somehow. Because the suffering of a ruler spreads outward. But so does peace. Meanwhile, in the distant Himalayas, dawn slowly approached the hidden golden cave. Soft blue light touched the snowy peaks. The two wild geese stood quietly beside the mountain lake. One gazed toward the southern horizon where kingdoms and cities still slept beneath dreams and desires. Then she whispered, perhaps the turtle's fall was not meaningless after all. The other lowered his head gently. No suffering is meaningless if wisdom grows from it. The mountains remained silent around them. Ancient. Patient. Watching generations of beings rise and disappear like mist. And above them all, the endless sky remained untouched. Just as the old monk had said. Storms arise. Storms pass. The sky remains. Back in Jetavana Monastery, the oil lamps had nearly burned out. Most of the younger monks sat completely motionless now. The story no longer felt like a tale about a turtle, or a king, or even speech itself. It had become a mirror. The Buddha looked upon them with deep compassion, then softly said, Bhikkhus, suffering does not end because the world becomes silent. It ends when the mind no longer clings to every sound. A long stillness followed. No one moved. No one wished to speak. The Blessed One continued, the foolish mind reacts immediately. The wise mind observes first. The forest outside had become perfectly still. And in that profound quiet, the monks could almost feel the truth directly inside their own breathing. Finally, the Buddha closed his eyes gently. And beneath the vast silence of the night, even the restless minds of the monks began, little by little, to rest. Several days later, the kingdom awoke beneath clear skies. The long rains had finally passed. Sunlight returned softly across Benares, touching temple towers, market streets, and palace rooftops with golden warmth. The rivers still moved heavily from the season's floods, but now their waters reflected open sky instead of storm clouds. People smiled more easily again. Children played outdoors. Merchants reopened riverside stalls. Musicians returned to public squares. And throughout the kingdom, life resumed its endless movement. Yet within King Brahmadatta, something quieter had begun. Not excitement. Not pleasure. Something deeper. A growing intimacy with silence. He no longer feared being alone with himself. Sometimes he still became restless. Sometimes old thoughts returned like echoes from another lifetime. But now he understood something essential. He did not need to obey every thought that entered his mind. This realization changed the texture of his entire existence. One morning before dawn, the king walked alone through the palace gardens while the rest of the world still slept. Mist drifted low across the grass. Lotus flowers remained closed against the cool air. The sky above the eastern horizon slowly brightened from black to deep blue. The king sat beside the lotus pond quietly. No attendants. No guards. Only birds awakening somewhere in distant trees. And there in the soft stillness before sunrise, a strange grief suddenly entered his heart. Not painful grief. Gentle grief. The kind that appears when illusion begins dissolving. He realized how much of his life had been spent asleep. Not physical sleep. Mental sleep. Endless reaction. Endless craving. Endless fear disguised as ambition. He remembered countless conversations he no longer even understood. Arguments fought desperately for pride alone. cruel words spoken simply because he himself had been suffering. How many people had he wounded merely because his own mind lacked peace? The king lowered his eyes. Tears formed silently. Not dramatic tears. Human tears. The tears of someone finally seeing clearly. And strangely, there was relief within the sadness. Because truth, even painful truth, carries freedom inside it. As dawn slowly spread across the pond, the minister's son approached quietly from the garden path. He stopped several steps away. The king did not hide his tears. This alone showed how deeply he had changed. The minister bowed respectfully, then sat beside him without speaking. Together they watched morning light unfold across the water. Finally, the king spoke softly. I used to believe wisdom meant becoming superior to others. The minister listened silently. But now, the king touched the pond water gently with his fingertips. I think wisdom may simply mean becoming honest with oneself. The minister smiled faintly. That is already a rare thing. The king stared into the rippling reflection of the sky. Tell me honestly. How does one know if transformation is real? The minister remained thoughtful for a long moment before answering. When suffering begins turning into compassion. The king looked toward him slowly. The young man continued, a proud person uses pain to justify hurting others. A wise person uses pain to understand the suffering of others. Wind moved softly through the trees above them. The king absorbed the words deeply. For years, he had believed authority required hardness. Now he began understanding another possibility. Gentleness was not weakness. Awareness was not weakness. Silence was not weakness. Perhaps true strength required no performance at all. The minister spoke again. The turtle died because it could not endure insult. He looked toward the brightening sky. But perhaps its final moment also contained awakening. The king nodded quietly. Yes. Because at the instant it fell, it saw the truth too late. The minister lowered his eyes slightly. Many beings never see it at all. Those words remained in the king's heart long after the conversation ended. That evening, he ordered something unexpected. For one full day each month, the royal court would observe silence except for matters truly necessary. No meaningless debate. No ceremonial praise. No endless speeches meant only to display intelligence. At first, many ministers secretly hated the idea. Some felt uncomfortable. Others feared silence would expose their insecurity. And many realized something disturbing. Without constant speaking, they barely understood who they were. But gradually, the practice changed the atmosphere of the court. People interrupted less. Listened more carefully. Even disagreements softened. Because silence slows the fire of reaction. And within slowness, understanding becomes possible. Months passed. Then seasons. The kingdom prospered quietly. Not because suffering disappeared. Floods still came. People still argued. Law still existed. But something important had changed at the center of power. The king himself was no longer feeding endless confusion into the world. Instead of reacting immediately, he listened. Instead of seeking victory in every conversation, he searched for clarity. And when anger arose within him, he learned to wait. Sometimes only a few breaths. But often, that was enough. Years later, people throughout Benares would remember Brahmadatta not as the king who conquered neighboring lands, but as the king who became peaceful. And many quietly said the same thing: the kingdom became calmer when the king became calmer. Because the mind of one person always touches countless others. Especially the mind of someone powerful. Meanwhile, high beyond human kingdoms, the snow mountains remained unchanged. Winter covered the golden cave once again. The two wild geese still lived beside the hidden lake in deep silence. Sometimes travelers passing through distant valleys claimed they heard strange echoes carried through the mountain winds. Not words exactly. More like fragments of memory. A voice trying to speak. Then vanishing into sky. And the old sages who heard these stories would smile softly and say, "Even now, the turtle continues teaching." Because wisdom does not always arrive through success. Sometimes it arrives through seeing clearly the cost of unconsciousness. The cost of pride. The cost of endless reaction. The cost of never learning silence. Back in Jetavana Monastery, the night had grown very deep. The younger monks remained motionless before the Buddha. No one wished for the story to end. Because many understood now, the turtle was not merely a creature from a distant lifetime. It was the restless human mind itself. Always reacting. Always defending. Always speaking. The Blessed One looked gently across the assembly. Then he spoke the final teaching. Because one who speaks carelessly harms both himself and others. But one who understands silence discovers the doorway to peace. The oil lamps flickered softly. A wise person does not ask, "How can I defeat others with words?" The Buddha's voice became quieter. He asks instead, "Is this speech necessary? Is it truthful? Is it kind? Will it reduce suffering?" A profound stillness filled the monastery. Then the Buddha lowered his eyes. And sometimes, the most compassionate words are the ones never spoken. No one moved afterward. Outside, the forest rested beneath moonlight. The wind passed gently through the trees. And somewhere far beyond kingdoms, beyond mountains, beyond all human noise, the endless sky remained silent. Just as it had always been. Night rested gently over Jataka monastery. The story had ended. Yet no one moved. The younger monks remained seated beneath the dim oil lamps, listening not to words now, but to the silence left behind by them. Outside, the forest breathed beneath moonlight. Leaves stirred softly in the cool night wind. Somewhere far away, water flowed through unseen stones. The world itself seemed quieter after the story. The Buddha sat completely still. His presence felt vast, like a mountain unmoved by passing weather. And within that silence, each monk began seeing his own life reflected back at him. One remembered a cruel argument spoken years before in anger. Another remembered endless debates driven only by pride. Another saw how often fear disguised itself as wisdom. And many recognized something deeply unsettling. Most of their suffering had not come from great tragedies. It had come from unconscious reactions. A sentence spoken too quickly. A moment of wounded pride. A desperate need to defend the self. The turtle lived inside all beings. Not merely as foolishness, but as restlessness, as the inability to remain still when the world touched the ego. At last, one young monk bowed respectfully and asked, "Blessed One, if silence is so important, should we stop speaking entirely?" The Buddha opened his eyes slowly. A gentle smile appeared. "No, Bhikkhu. Silence itself is not wisdom." The monk listened carefully. The Blessed One continued, "A silent fool remains a fool." Soft laughter moved quietly through the assembly. What matters is not the absence of words, but the presence of awareness. The Buddha lifted one hand calmly. Words spoken from greed create suffering. Words spoken from anger create suffering. Words spoken from vanity create suffering. He lowered his hand again. But words spoken from compassion can heal the world. The monks sat motionless. The oil lamps flickered like tiny stars within darkness. The Buddha's voice became softer now. The turtle did not die because speech itself was evil. It died because unconsciousness controlled the speech. A deep stillness filled the monastery once more. The younger monks understood now. The teaching had never truly been about silence alone. It was about awakening. Awareness before reaction. Understanding before speech. Compassion before ego. The Buddha looked toward the night sky beyond the monastery walls. Most beings live like leaves caught in storm winds, pulled endlessly by praise and blame, gain and loss, pleasure and pain, fear and desire. His eyes reflected the moonlight quietly. But the awakened mind becomes like the open sky. The monks listened as though hearing truth itself breathe. Storms may still pass through it, but the sky is never harmed. Wind moved gently through the forest, and for several long moments, no one spoke, because suddenly, there was nothing more to add. The story of the turtle had already entered their hearts completely. Some monks felt grief. Some felt peace. Some felt shame for words they could never take back. Yet beneath every emotion existed something deeper now, awareness. And awareness changes everything. The Blessed One closed his eyes briefly. Then he spoke one final time. Because in this world, many believe strength means winning. Winning arguments. Winning praise. Winning power. But true strength is much quieter. The night seemed to hold its breath around him. One who conquers another remains vulnerable. But one who conquers his own restless mind. The Buddha's voice became almost like a whisper carried through ancient trees. Can no longer be destroyed by the world. Silence followed. Long sacred. Infinite. And somewhere within that silence, the monks began understanding something impossible to explain with language. Peace was never hidden in distant mountains. Never trapped inside sacred texts. Never granted by kings or wealth or praise. It had always existed beneath the noise, waiting patiently, like clear sky behind clouds. Outside, moonlight spread across the sleeping forest. The trees stood motionless beneath silver light. The world continued exactly as before. Yet for those who truly listened, everything had changed. Far away, beyond kingdoms and monasteries, beyond human memory itself, the snow mountains remained eternal beneath the stars. The hidden golden cave still rested beside the silent lake. The two wild geese slept peacefully near the water's edge. And above them stretched the endless sky. The same sky seen by kings, by monks, by turtles, by every suffering being who had ever searched for peace. Storms had crossed it for countless ages. Wars, empires, births, deaths, joy, grief, all appearing briefly, then vanishing. Yet the sky remained untouched. infinite, silent, whole. And perhaps that was the final teaching. Not that life would become free from storms, but that beneath every storm, something vast and peaceful already exists. Something no insult can wound, no fear can corrupt, no death can destroy. The ancients called it many names: wisdom, awakening, liberation. But on quiet nights beneath moonlight, it can simply be felt as silence. A living silence. A compassionate silence. A silence that asks for nothing and heals everything. Back in Jataka, the final oil lamp slowly burned out. Darkness filled the monastery hall softly and completely. The monks remained seated for a long time afterward. No one wished to disturb the stillness. No one wished to speak unnecessarily. Because now they understood, the deepest truths do not shout. They arrive quietly, like snowfall in distant mountains, like moonlight touching water, like a king finally sleeping peacefully after a lifetime of noise. And somewhere beyond the forest, beyond the sleeping world, beyond every restless human thought, the silent sky remained, watching, waiting, unmoving, as it always had, as it always would.